Hello everyone. In this video, I want to present a theodicy destroying thought experiment called Paradise Hell. Now, by theodicy destroying, I just mean that this thought experiment can provide an undercutting defeater for just about any kind of theodicy or even defense against the problem of evil, or at least the ones that I've heard so far in all my years of study on the subject. But before I get into the specifics of the thought experiment, I'd like to give some background first. Now, the debate between theists and atheists has raged for literally thousands of years, with no end in sight, and I think it's important we look at why. Probably the best tool in the atheist arsenal is the problem of evil, and very many theistic and Christian philosophers will readily admit that many responses to it are particularly poor. Still, even those theists will say that there are some successful responses to the problem of evil. And so, if that's the case, why then do atheists persist in believing that God doesn't exist? The issue here is that all theodicies or attempted explanations as to why an all good and loving God permits evil and suffering really boils down to what is known as a value question. A value question is always going to be answered with a subjective opinion because it always comes down to something along the lines of, is X worth Y amount of cost? And I can make this more clear with an example. Imagine we're in the middle of a particularly hot summer, and let's say my air conditioner seems to not be working as well as it should. So I call a repair company and they come back and they say it'll cost you $2,000 to fix it immediately, or if you could wait a week, it'll only cost you $1,500. Now, at this point, I'm faced with a value question. Is it worth it to me to be comfortable in my house immediately for $500, or is the money I'd save worth more than a week's worth of my discomfort? As you can imagine, how you answer this very much depends on a number of factors. Perhaps I or someone else in the house has a medical condition, and being in high heat can lead to sickness or even death. Or maybe I'm a billionaire, and so the $500 is so insignificant that I just pay to have it fixed immediately. On the other hand, maybe I don't make so much money at all, and I don't have the spare $500. Or maybe I live alone and I don't mind the heat all that much, and so I'd rather just have the extra money. This is ultimately what theodicies come down to, and it's why it is said that Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga has answered the logical problem of evil when he offered what was known as a defense. That is, by offering a reason why God permits evil, even if it is an implausible one. By giving such a reason, it gives the theist an out from the logical argument disproving the existence of God. Supposedly, what we are then left with is called the evidential problem of evil, which is really where I think theists and atheists have largely been playing for thousands of years. The theist offers a theodicy to explain that some kind of evil necessitating good is why a loving God permits evil, which may be convincing to a number of other theists, but then the atheists don't think that particular good is worth all the evil and suffering, and so they don't buy the theodicy or the defense. Again, let's make this clear with an example that prompted me to come up with this argument. Um, it's a point about evils and goods from eminent Christian philosopher and apologist Richard Swinburne. So suppose that one less person had been burnt by the Hiroshima atomic bomb, and then there would have been less opportunity for courage and sympathy, one less piece of information about the effects of atomic radiation, less people, relatives of the person burnt, who would have had a strong desire for nuclear disarmament and to campaign for that, and against imperialist expansion and so on. Of course, the removal of one bad state or the possibility of one bad state will not remove much good any more than removing one grain of sand will make much difference to the fact that you still have a heap of sand. But the removal of one grain of sand will make a bit of difference, and so the removal of one bad state. So to be clear here, Swinburne is making a point about how it is worth it for people to be killed in the nuclear explosion of Hiroshima because it gave opportunity for courage and sympathy, as well as information about the effects of atomic radiation, and it created people who have a strong desire to campaign for nuclear disarmament, etc. No, Swinburne doesn't have to say that this is worth it on the whole, Rather, that God lets the nuclear explosions happen so that he can get certain goods, and if he gets rid of all the evil, he necessarily gets rid of all the goods. And God doesn't want to get rid of all the good states that would come with having all of these bad ones. Now, for me, I think such a trade-off is insanely implausible. But a theist is well within their rights to disagree, right? And there's no easy way to decide who's right and who's wrong in this. So, are we just left in a millennia-long impasse where atheists think any given theodicy is implausible, and the theists say that it's obviously correct, and we don't have a way to break this tie? Well, here's where I think I have a thought experiment that could shed some light on whether or not theists really do think that these goods are really worth the evils and suffering that their theodicies say they are. Consider a thought experiment where a loving God decrees that after a life much like our own here, non-believers are sent to paradise hell, where they will be in eternal loving communion with God, and there will be no suffering or evil for the rest of eternity, or at least their eternity. But then the believers will be sent to another life much like our existence here on earth. In their new life, they may have it easy or hard, determined randomly, but will be guaranteed to perform the kinds of goods that can only be accomplished if evil and suffering are permitted. If they perish in that life, then they move on to another afterlife just like it, and so on for all eternity. Now, the question to the theist is, which afterlife do you want to get sent to? I think the answer is pretty clear. Everyone wants to go to paradise. The problem for the theist is that in choosing paradise, they reveal that the goods that necessitate evil and suffering really aren't worth it. Now, what I like the most about this thought experiment is exactly how versatile it is. It can be modified to account for the very wide variety of theistic views and apologetics to stave off the problem of evil and still make its point. Perhaps the theist wants to say that free will is a great good that unfortunately requires that evil be permitted. Well, we could say that in paradise hell, the non-believers are not free, but rather the beatific vision of being in direct commune with God has them so enraptured that they cannot help but love God. Conversely, the believers would be sent to new worlds, are well and truly free to choose to love God in the face of suffering. If free will is so incredibly valuable, then why wouldn't the theists want to choose to avoid paradise hell and retain their free will, even if it necessitates suffering? That's, after all, the reason we have free will in the first place, at least according to that theodicy. Or maybe the theist doesn't like that theodicy. They say the people in heaven retain their free will, but are transformed into beings who will always freely choose to do the good. Well, we could say paradise hell is much the same, and so we non-believers are transformed to always freely choose the good. But after all, there still has to be some value in being able to choose to do evil. Otherwise, God would have just made us all always freely choose to do the good from the get-go, and we would never exist on earth. We'd exist in paradise for eternity since creation, at least. So in the end, the theists are still kind of forced to go back into a world of suffering and evil to let whatever it is, the goods that obtain from us being able to choose evil necessitates, right? Otherwise, the theodicy doesn't exist. Now, maybe the theist wants to say that soul building is such a great good that it's worth all the evil and suffering that we endure here on earth. Now, if we take theistic claims about heaven and the end of the world seriously, well, eventually the universe stops existing and people are sorted out into heaven or hell, and so the amount of soul building in the universe is necessarily finite. People in heaven no longer have soul building in the suffering necessitating sense, and the people in hell never get redeemed. So the particular kind of soul building that necessitates suffering and evil is finite. But not so in my thought experiment. After all the poor souls condemned to paradise hell do not get to engage in any of the kind of suffering necessitating soul building. They just are immediately transformed into redeemed finite creatures. So if they do any soul building, it's not of the kind that requires suffering. Whereas believers, they get all that precious soul building that absolutely necessitates evil and suffering forever. That's an infinite amount of soul building related goods. To bring it back to Swinburne's Theodicy, think about how those in Paradise Hell do not get to struggle for nuclear disarmament. They merely have a kind of cold, detached knowledge of the horrors of suffering nuclear explosions. Conversely, the faithful will be able to learn firsthand what it's like to go through a nuclear explosion or the pain of being separated from their loved ones. And they can work tirelessly to ensure that nuclear weapons don't get used again, at least in that particular afterlife world. Now, maybe these examples of popular theodicies are a little too specific and raw that they don't stand up when we look at them in this kind of a light. But Paradise Hell as a thought experiment works just as well against non-specific responses to the problem of evil, like skeptical theism. Skeptical theism says that we don't know what reason God has for permitting evil and suffering, but theists can rest assured that God has such a reason. Well, all we have to do is amend the thought experiment to say that the theist would have to choose to avoid paradise hell and go back into a world that contains evil and suffering so as to achieve whatever the reason is God permits evil and suffering for in the first place. After all, it has to be a pretty good reason, maybe even a reason that finite creatures could never hope to understand. But in order for the skeptical theist response to work, that reason has to be worth all the evil and suffering. So why would this reason not carry on for all eternity? In each case of theodicy, when we combine it with the theistic versions of the afterlife, we're always left with a finite amount of whatever the evil necessitating good is, because eventually the world ends and we all get sorted to some kind of afterlife. And there's either no redemption in hell or there's no more evil and suffering in heaven. So whatever the goods are that necessitate evil and suffering don't persist. But if those goods are to be considered worth all the evil and suffering, then why wouldn't God want an infinite amount of them? Now, this is in contrast with the goods obtained in a paradise where there's no evil or suffering. There always gets to be an infinite amount of those goods, right? But because you just exist in paradise forever anyway, right? Even in the normal conception of heaven. Now, perhaps the theist could reflect on the finite amount of evil necessitating goods and say that after this world, the universe is over, God will continue to create new worlds with new beings after everyone from our world has ascended into their afterlife state. This lets the believers go to paradise, but God still gets his steady or infinite stream of evil necessitating goods. Well, the problem with that response is that it doesn't show that those goods are actually worth it because all the theist is doing is passing the buck along for someone else to pay the bill. They still want to be in paradise where they no longer produce the goods that require evil and suffering. If those goods are so worth the cost, then why wouldn't they want to go back into a world where evil and suffering exist so as to demonstrate them? Remember, the point of this argument is to show that these supposed goods aren't actually worth the price that they supposedly demand, and I don't think theists can avoid that conclusion when confronted with a question posed in the Paradise Hell thought experiment. Now, I want to take a step back and point out how responses to the question of theism and especially monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where there's a triomni God and an afterlife where at least a heaven or a heaven and a hell always boils down to a kind of a value question. The primary problem in the theist and atheist debate is that it's a metaphysical question. And metaphysical questions are the kind of things that never gets a definitive answer by the very nature of the topic. If we could get definitive answers one way or the other, the question would no longer be metaphysical, and it would be logical or scientific. The issue here is that we don't approach these questions in a vacuum detached from our wants and desires. And I think it is here that we find a rare asymmetry between theists and non-theists of all stripes. Many Christians like to say that atheists only reject Christianity and the arguments of Christian apologists because they, quote unquote, just want to sin. And perhaps one of the best examples of this from the modern day is with Christian apologist Frank Turek. Here's a tweet from Mr. Turek. He says, you're raising all of these objections because you're sleeping with your girlfriend. Am I right? All the blood drained from the young man's face. He was caught. He was rejecting God because he didn't like God's morality. Now, what I find particularly amazing about this reply is the implication that the non-Christian somehow knows that God is real and that Christianity is true, but wants to engage in behavior that is against the Christian religion and so pretends it is not true. But this doesn't make any sense. In such a case, the person would just say that all the premarital sex or whatever kind of supposed sin it is that they want to enjoy is just worth going to hell for. After all, that's how it supposedly works on the Christian outlook, right? You can do anything you want so long as you're willing to pay the price. Could you imagine the young man, after 14 billion years of burning in hell, thinking to himself, all that sex was so good, it was worth this eternity of suffering? Well, no, of course not. That is clearly absurd. But what's really going on is that the non-Christian doesn't actually believe that their actions warrant or at least will result in an eternity of conscious torture. They don't think any of that is real. And so they reject the morality of Christianity because they don't think Christianity and its consequences are true. However, consider the opposite situation for the theist. They're forced to adopt what appear to be incredibly implausible views on what is worth it for all this evil and suffering. But why? What's the payoff? Well, because they want theism to be true. They want an afterlife in paradise, to live forever, to be reunited with their loved ones, to escape a hard and cruel world. They admit this every time they make an argument about how if God does not exist, then there can be no objective meaning or purpose. Now, that's a ridiculous argument, as I've gone over in other videos, because purpose and meaning are literally mind and stance-dependent things, and all the theist gets is a subjective to God version of meaning and purpose. But they betray the argument when instead of talking about that, they speak of the horrors of an atheistic universe that results in a heat death, where everyone eventually ceases to exist after death, regardless of how they live their lives. It is the fear of that particular reality that apologists are really trying to stoke when they make an argument for objective meaning and purpose. Now, I don't particularly believe that I will cease to exist when I die because I find it very comforting or poetically beautiful. I believe I will cease to exist when I die because it seems to me that my conscious existence is tied to the continued workings of my very physical body, and that when the body stops, so does my consciousness. Now, perhaps the theist may counter that I do very much prefer a world where everyone ceases to exist when they die to the kind of world that most theists subscribe to, where hell exists and billions of people suffer eternal conscious torture. Now, the theist would be right. I do believe that the atheistic outlook is infinitely preferable to a world where hell is real. But that doesn't force me to say I adopt all sorts of incredibly implausible value judgments about what goods are worth it. Any atheist is as free as they wish to adopt a kind of universalist theism of any given monotheistic religion that they find plausible. There are a variety of interpretations of the major monotheistic religions where there is no hell and everyone gets to go to heaven, or maybe there's just annihilationism, right? So there's no hell or suffering or anything like that. Those are all on the table. And this is why I like the paradise hell argument so much, because it uses exactly what most theists truly want as a lever to expose that they very likely don't actually hold the value judgments that they say they do. And this is a point I made when I critiqued William Lane Craig, saying that he finds the possibility of heaven and a loving God so desirable that he lowers the level of evidence necessary to believe it. I had asked a question, which was relayed through a third party on the Capturing Christianity stream to Dr. Craig, about why wouldn't we lower the level of evidence to believe in universalism? And here Dr. Craig's response was legendary. He asked immediately, but at what cost would universalism need to be true? We'd have to give up free will being valuable if God were to just save those who rejected him in this life and transform them in heaven. He rejects universalism because if it were true, then it would disvalue the theodicy he finds most plausible, i.e., the free will theodicy to explain why we have all this evil in the first place. The thing is, he never stops to ask, but at what cost? To wonder why a triumni God would create a world where not only is there evil and suffering, but an eternal conscious torture chamber called hell, all to get a subset of created beings up into an eternity of heaven. For Dr. Craig, clearly all the evil, suffering, and torture of hell is worth it for that, but having free will not be valuable enough to stop God from letting all creatures be saved in heaven? Well, that's just too high of a cost to pay. This is what makes the thought experiment of paradise hell so valuable. I think particularly if atheists start using it in debates with apologists. I think that for any believers who are questioning their faith and aren't enmeshed in the world of apologetics, this is a very clarifying question that truly illuminates what they actually value. Finally, I'd like to thank both Emerson Green for his post on Twitter that prompted me to think of this argument, as well as Dr. Stephen Law, whose evil God argument inspired this thought experiment. Thank you all for watching.